And so I was very fortunate to work for a mentor who was the top biller at Korn Ferry, who went out and
How does somebody get on your radar?
a number of our clients will employ a psychometric assessment, and that could be
So
something.
this is a good time to transition to a question you brought up earlier, and it's for people who have been caught up in a layoff or Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the VentureLoop Executive Insider. I'm Jeremy McCarthy, CEO of VentureLoop, and I've got Dan Grosh with me today, a managing director at Fleming Martin, an executive search firm. Dan, thanks for joining me. Dan and I go way back, and I mean way, way back to the ground zero of the .com days in San Francisco. We actually figured out we worked together probably initially as consultants doing recruiting at Macromedia. For those of you who are a little bit on the younger side, you probably have no idea what that company is, but it was eventually acquired by Adobe. Dan, welcome to the show. And why don't you start off, just give us a little bit of background on yourself. What do you want the audience to know about you?
Yeah, it's great to be here, Jeremy, and of course, great to catch up with you as well. So I moved to the Bay Area in 1995, 1996 from Minneapolis. So I graduated from the University of Minnesota, grew up in Minnetonka, and decided I wanted to become a recruiter. And so, what better place, right? No better place than being in Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom. And so, was privy to some really fascinating experiences as a contract recruiter initially. So I started in contingent labor, placing contingent labor engineers mainly that were coding in mainframe technologies, Fortran, et cetera, and then moved quickly into contract recruiting. And so one of my first gigs was at Macromedia, where I did meet Jeremy. And then I decided I wanted to have an impact at the highest levels of a company. And so I got my MBA and then decided to move into retained executive search. And so I was very fortunate to work for a mentor who was the top biller at Korn Ferry, who went out and
Wow.
started his own firm. And then I joined Boyd and Global, which is a big, large executive search firm, top 10 in the world, 65 offices around the country, and led their tech practice in the Americas. Then was also fortunate to join Caliber One as a managing partner in the US to work with the two founders to grow out and grow up the business. And so we were able to scale the US 4 to 5 times. And it was a really incredible run during the time after the Great Recession. And then more recently, I did get some experience going in-house. So I worked with Diversus Capital as an operating partner for talent and spun up their human capital capabilities. They are a 2 billion AUM private, lower mid-market private equity firm that focuses on technology investments. And so did that for a handful of years. And now, I've recently joined Fleming Martin from another very, very large executive search firm.
Great. Maybe give me a little more information about Fleming Martin. What's kind of the size and scope of that firm? What do you guys focus on? Is it pretty broad? I'm not too familiar with them.
Yeah, so Marty and Fleming, the two individuals in which the firm is named after, I've known for 15 years and almost joined them when they were founding the firm. And so I decided to join Caliber One. That was the right opportunity at the time, but this has been a full circle moment in terms of joining two friends and colleagues that I have great respect for in the business. So our focus, we're a boutique, we're a small boutique, very, very targeted focus. So there are a couple of us that focus on technology businesses. So that includes consumer technology, hard tech, enterprise software, and AI. And then we have a couple of sub functions that we focus on. And so I specifically focus on placing technology execs, so chief AI officers, chief product officers, chief technology officers, and then I also focus on the commercial side, so chief executive officer and chief revenue officers. My colleagues Marty and Craig focus on G&A functions, so both finance and HR for these technology companies, and then Fleming focuses on life sciences companies.
Awesome.
And so
So
that's
before,
across North America.
okay. Do you guys do any international, or is it strictly US based?
Strictly US and Canada.
Gotcha. So before we jump into current day, a lot of people aren't very familiar with how an executive search partner works within kind of the venture private equity world. Can you maybe give a little bit of a explanation of what's the difference between your role working internally at a venture type of a firm versus being an outsider working for an executive search firm?
Sure. So I'll start with executive search. So we represent our clients, which are the companies that retain us to fill either a big confidential C-level search, or you know whether they're again backfilling a role, replacing a role, or scaling up and needing to hire an executive. So we are focused again on representing our client. At the same time, what we do is very much a marketplace, and so we are a matchmaker, is the way that I see myself. And so, our goal is to find the very, very best exec and make sure that they fit within the core parameters of hiring for competency, making sure that they're the right culture and compatibility fit, and they fit within the compensation grades or the compensation bands that the client requires. So on the venture private equity side, a talent partner will not only specifically represent the firm in which they're employed, but they'll also represent the portfolio companies. And so sometimes there is a broader mandate, and so that was my mandate. So my core mandate at Diversis was to do executive recruiting. At the same time, there were other human capital capabilities in which I was heavily involved and or leading. So, looking at compensation studies and market mapping compensation, making sure that we had the appropriate assessment tools, getting involved in integration work. So when there would be a roll up or an acquisition that a company would make, we would be involved in, again, making sure that that acquisition went smoothly. In addition, just anything around, human capital, HR, organizational development, culture building, change management
So maybe a little
for the
broader,
companies and for the fund.
right? So a little broader in scope than your more traditional executive search.
Yes.
And um,
I would
when
also add brand building was another one in terms of being a culture ambassador. So being out there, in the market, doing events, but having that, the marketing lens, and in terms of representing and being the brand ambassador for the firm.
Gotcha. So on our show here, what we want to do is kind of help people get a little bit of a inside baseball view, so to speak, of how things work. So you and I have seen kind of how the sausage is made behind the scenes. Maybe why don't we start with, if you've got somebody who's an executive or an upcoming person who's going to be in the executive ranks, how do you describe how the process works if a company goes out and hires a retained search firm to find somebody for a particular role? Help the audience understand, if you're an executive or upcoming person going to be an executive, how do they fit into this process? What really happens once you get the call and somebody says, we need your help?
So when we get the call, it's usually for a very, very specific mandate and a specific need. And so a client is looking for a candidate that brings, usually in most cases, some niche differentiation. So they're going to bring differentiation in terms of their background, what verticals in which they play in, and again, a unique skill set that they bring to the table across the different functions. So again, if we're hiring for a CRO, we're usually looking for somebody, let's say it's a $50 million private equity backed business. They are looking for a CRO that has moved the needle in a company that has, let's say, ideally grown from 50 to 150 million. And so they have taken that company through taken a similar company through a similar journey. And they bring, again, the skill set and the playbook to be able to execute upon that.
Gotcha.
Same
So
if it were, go ahead, Jeremy.
no, so you kind of get everything defined up front, and obviously, you know, a company's not going to pay the kind of fees that they do unless it's something they really need some assistance with and some high-end assistance. Uh, how does that process start? Do you typically have a pretty good database of people you've already identified, or do you have your researchers go out and you're usually starting relatively from scratch, and you've got to go identify these people because, as you said, it's usually a very very defined mandate on exactly the kind of person they're looking for.
Yeah. So it really starts with the assessment before anything else. It's assessing the business, the need, defining the process, and so making sure, we know which key stakeholders are going to be involved, what they're going to be interviewing for, what we're solving for in the need. And so we need to understand, not only the job description, but also the OKRs that are going to be involved in terms of the expectation of that executive, what they need to achieve within the first 6 months, the first year, et cetera, but also understanding the pitfalls and what they need to navigate and what didn't go right the first time, or again, what we're trying to solve for. And so usually, again, if we're replacing an incumbent, where are we trying to improve? If it's not replacing an incumbent, but it's more, hey, we need to scale up and we just don't have the right capabilities to do that. So, what who is that right person? What defines them? And what is the background that we're specifically looking for that is going to fit this need? So we start there, as well as understanding the company's value proposition, how we need to appropriately pitch the company to the market, and how we're going to craft a really compelling story that is going to woo an executive that is sitting in another seat, that is not actively looking, but to be able to woo them out, to make, again, a compelling case for why to join this company that we're representing. So it starts there. Then the process is identifying the right target market. So, okay, this company plays in a very specific vertical, and so we are looking for, again, companies that hit the bullseye. So competitor companies and or companies that are really, really close to that ecosystem. And so then yes, and then we're mining our database. We're looking at first degree and second degree connects, and we're going after folks that are highly insulated, that again are not active, because the majority of the market is currently working, and there is a bias to working with our clients. Tend to want to work with folks that are currently employed. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, and there are exceptional candidates that are on the bench, and we could talk about that later in terms of how to a candidate who's been on the bench for a while, how to position that effectively. But ultimately, we're building a source list of really highly curated targets that are going to match this role.
Okay, and now within the firm, you usually have researchers that do some of the initial outreach, kind of gauge initial fit and interest. In the role you're at now, at a managing director level, to what degree do you get hands-on involved with some of the initial evaluation of candidates? Or are you looking at the filtered list and kind of helping to redirect the research team? Give us a little better understanding how that works internally.
Yeah, so the beauty about working in a small boutique is I'm very hands-on. So I'm making a number of the first calls, especially if they're first degree within the network. I mean, that is what I expected as a talent partner at Diversis when I was working with external partners, and so that is something that I'm absolutely doing in terms of making the outreach to, again, the existing network, even some really high targeted individuals that I know that I can get on the phone. Even if they're second degree, I'm asking for introductions from first degree, and then I'm making that first introduction call. In addition to that, I'm doing a lot of blind referencing as well, even on folks that I've known for years, because maybe that relationship, I've been in touch over the years, but I haven't been closely involved with that person in terms of seeing what they've been doing on a day-to-day basis. And so the blind referencing is a critical component to do that early and often upfront in our business. Because we're definitely doing a full top grading interview, but in addition to that, and maybe there's a psychometric assessment as well. But in addition to that, we do need objective referencing as well to complete the picture.
So
So
you
that's
brought up
upfront.
so you brought up something interesting. So psychometric assessment. What does that mean? Do you have kind of a standard grading system you use? Is that just more conversational evaluation? What can somebody expect if they talk to an executive search firm and they do those types of evaluations?
So a number of our clients will employ a psychometric assessment, and that could be something like, Hogan or DISC or Watson Glazier, but there's, several of them, criteria, and so, culture index. And so it really depends on if there is a preference for our clients. And then again, I'm versed in a number of those assessments and have um, again, those assessments have been involved in the process for a number of candidates. So, I'm accustomed to evaluating the output, so to speak. But yeah, that is a process. I mean, the different assessments take different lengths of time depending on the complexity. Some take 10 to 15 minutes. Others can take a couple of hours. So it really depends on the assessment.
I'm curious now, to give you some insight. I know someone who was a senior HR executive at Target many years ago, and they employed some of these tests for their hiring practices. And there was a lawsuit that happened where they were told this is, being relied upon too heavily. It's not legal to do this. You're using this as a primary screening mechanism. And the interesting thing, talking to this executive, she said that the reality is that the accuracy of these tests was incredible. I mean, even back like 30 years ago. She said that every time we hired somebody that we thought, well, the interview went really well, even though the testing doesn't show there's a good fit, she said every single time it didn't work out. And so, especially in California, they require you can only do certain weighting on these tests. Now that happens, at the non-executive level, and that's where most of your risk is. I'm curious what your experience has been at the executive level, because at Target, they were looking at things like, is this somebody who's going to show up for work? Is this somebody who's going to steal from the inventory? Is this somebody who's going to be a lazy performer? Executive level, it's obviously those issues are a bit different. I'm curious what you've seen using these tests for executive level candidates.
So, yeah, I've seen mixed results as well. And so, again, my MO, or what I believe, is that an objective blind reference can verify some of the components or some of the assessments results. So, assessments will typically show, how does somebody think about solving a problem? Or what is their work style? And to some level, I feel like it covers, high level EQ, IQ, EQ. But ultimately, I think an objective blind reference is going to really get to the nitty and gritty of that. And so you're able to say, okay, how did someone display their, EQ and their self-awareness at the company? Specifically, where was this seen? Where was this shown? How did this show up? So you can get way more detailed on, again, a very specific and highly relevant blind reference. If, of course, it's the right blind reference. And so you need to be making sure that, it's not, some third degree way, remote, didn't see that executive in action. But I think, if you can get, um, a former superior, a subordinate, and a peer, if you can get, blind references from each employer, each past employer, I think that just, and if there's consistency as well in that objective back channeling, that really tells, I think, a more consistent story. And in those cases, it's more seldom that a blind reference has not been accurate.
So, how often do you get references that don't really match what you got on the testing, where like this is not the same person who did the testing?
Again, I would say like 50 to 75% accuracy. Because at that stage, usually when we move to the assessment stage, it's a candidate that is in final process.
Gotcha.
And in a lot of cases, again, the blind references have, confirmed that individual's viability for the role.
Got it.
And so we wouldn't be moving them if again, the blind references were not positive. We would not be putting them forward in the process in the first place. So in a lot of cases, again, it would, confirm the validity.
Okay. So taking a step back, you've done a good job kind of explaining how your initial part of the process works. How does somebody get on your radar? If you don't have an active search, you and most executive search firms pretty actively networking for potential candidates for the future, how does somebody get you to take notice of them if they want to be sure if the right opportunity surfaces for them that you're out there looking for it?
Yeah. So it's really the ABC approach, always be networking. And so if somebody is coming through a very warm source and somebody that I trust, they're going to get my attention. They're also going to get my attention if um, they're unique. And so something that stands out, The Wolf of Wall Street, where the wolf goes in for his first interview at his first place before he starts Stratton Oakmont. And his mentor at the time asked him, he said, "Did you really pitch a stock to get in here?" He stood out, right? He was
Yep.
unique. He took a really unique approach. And so the same goes for getting my attention. So if somebody is not coming in through a very, very strong first degree, then they've got to catch my attention some other way. And so, if it's a big, long Dead Sea Scroll like, introduction, and I could tell that it's AI slop and it's just long, and I'm just not going to go through it. And so, but if it's something quick and catches my attention, hey, I just had this massive exit, and, here's how I significantly impacted the company, and it's like two sentences, it'd be great to, connect for the future. Okay, that is, again, going to catch my attention way more than something that, again, is just, poorly written, or they haven't done their homework on me. Like I get, somebody who is working in like food and beverage or working in, different industries. I'm just not, I'm not the recruiter that could help them. And so again, it's just making sure that they do their research up front, and ideally, they've gotten to me through a very, very strong connection with an
So
endorsement.
that's good advice. I suspect you, like most of us, you've got an overflowing inbox. You've got active searches you're working on. You've got fires to put out. when you get an email from somebody you don't know, you don't have time to scroll through past that first page of a couple of sentences, bullet points, whatever it is, to know, is this somebody that I want to know more about? So if you don't have a warm introduction, and I'd say even if you do have a warm introduction, um, having a very short, direct, like you said, first couple sentences or just a few quick bullet points that somebody can quickly review in 5 to 10 seconds as they're looking through their email, and can quickly target, yes, this is interesting, this is somebody who I want to make sure I've got a connection to. Now when you do get their attention, I'm curious, when you're networking, how do you typically connect? Do you like to meet with these people in person? Unless there's an active search, do you typically just say, hey, let's keep in touch, I'll keep you in mind? Uh, do you kind of try and keep these warm, or you recommend that those individuals kind of keep you warm by doing an occasional outreach? What's the most effective way for you?
So a couple of ways. I would definitely put them into tiers of priority. So if I need to be, if there is an executive I just absolutely need to know, then I'm going to go meet with them. So put them in tier A, because I know that, you know, they're placeable. They come in through, again, a very, very strong source. I know that, I can make meaningful introductions so I can have an impact for them. Even if I don't have a search available to them, I know that I can help them network, which again then makes my network stronger, and my network appreciates those introductions. So that's what I look for first, is again somebody who, and has a track history, right? In terms of, they have a track history of impact, and again they're in my wheelhouse in terms of where I make my placements. So that would be group A. I would say group B is, okay, I might not have something immediately, but I should definitely have, in my network. And so, may take 5-10 minutes on the phone, or may say, hey, I don't have something immediate. By the way, we have a guide, by the way, for, out of work executives or executives that are looking, that is a really terrific resource guide that we send to, each of our, actively looking, network. And so, we've got guides for, again, technology, product, AI, right? Expertise, expertise on the commercial side, expertise on the G&A side. So we're trying to be as helpful as possible, again, even if we don't, have something. And then, there's then the third bucket, which is, it's just, it's a mismatch, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so just complete mismatch. And those, I spend time, on the stars, so to speak. And so, group A and sometimes group B.
So maybe it's a good time to transition to a question you brought up earlier, and it's for people who have been caught up in a layoff, or even people who may have been fired. I mean, I've met some amazing people who have been outright fired from jobs by executives who were just horrible human beings, and
Sure. Yep.
they just didn't get a chance to leave before the tyrant they were working for decided to cut them loose. So I see these sometimes as kind of two different stories. You've got people like, I know people who've worked for Facebook, for Twitter, for Microsoft, for Google. They're senior level, they've got long accomplishments, and occasionally they just get let go. Especially I saw with Meta, they recently let go. It was indiscriminate. It was just, it didn't matter. Maybe they had a couple very key people. They said, we just can't lose these people. But there were some incredible people that they used essentially an AI algorithm to select who are the people that need to go. And there was no real rhyme or reason performance wise. Those people don't typically have an issue, because once they hit the market, so many people already know them, know about them. Uh, they still, even without a job, have kind of their pick of the market. And then you've got a number of people who work at a company that initially looked promising, never quite made it. It's not a name brand company. Person may be a really strong candidate for a lot of different options, but they don't stand out because they just don't have that brand or name recognition. How do you coach people or recommend people position themselves, especially as that timeline starts to lag? Where sometimes maybe they've got some savings, they take a month off, 6 weeks off, and then they get in the market, and they first couple things they look at don't really look like they're something they want, and then before they know it, it's 3, 4, 5 months that they've got a gap. What's
Yeah.
your advice to people in those positions?
So preparation is key in terms of having your stories ready. And so this is something that I learned in training with Lee Hecht Harrison. So situation, so the acronym is called SOAR. It stands for Situation, Obstacle, Action, Result. And so have your SOAR stories ready because, ultimately companies are hiring for value, right? So where somebody can make an impact, where they can make a company money, where they can save a company money, where again they can make a company more productive. A couple of things that an executive can do to stand out. So first, to have their stories ready. And so something that I learned at Lee Hecht Harrison when I was thinking of being an outplacement consultant. Um, the acronym that Lee Hecht uses is called Situation, Obstacle, Action, Result, SOAR stories. Um, and so to have those ready, because what companies are looking for is somebody who can be an impact player, where they can help make a company money, save them money, or make them more productive. So, if somebody's, let's say, coming from product, they have great stories around, hey, I was a product leader and I took over this really, you know, I was a part of a company that was going through a transformation and we had to completely transform the company, transform the product. And here's how I did this. So, I went and I talked to a bunch of customers and did a full assessment in terms of a competitor analysis. And, I worked with the team in terms of feature functionality to really build in, unique differentiation. And then, we built this thing and took it to market. And here's where we made a massive impact. So, but here was the hurdle that we had to cross over, right? Because we were stuck and didn't have a lot of budget to work with, and so but here's how we overcame that challenge. Here's how we did it. And so to have those stories ready. Also, when somebody's going through a transition, it's awful, right? In terms of somebody being laid off. I mean, it's the equivalent of a divorce, really, for a lot of folks. And so, but at the same time, if that comes across in a way, you got to fake it till you make it a little bit. And so this was really unfortunate that I was let go, as were a lot of people. But here's what I learned from that experience, and here's where I can really add value to a company. And so you're quickly pivoting through it. You're acknowledging it because you're showing some EQ and some self awareness that and the interviewer, if they're a good interviewer, they're going to ask what happened, right? And
Yeah.
so like you need to be honest about it, but you don't need to drone on about it. It just, this was a misfit, or this caught me by surprise. I really was surprised by this. I did not expect this, but I was, a part of this riff. But here's where I made, an impact for the company, and here's where I know that I can make an impact for you moving forward. Here are my superpowers. So I think again, it's acknowledge. And then quickly move to superpowers. So where you are bringing significant differentiation, whether that's unique differentiation, niche differentiation, or broad differentiation, which is a little harder in today's day and age. And then there's, of course, cost differentiation, but I know a lot of folks don't want to be a cost differentiator. So, again, here's where I am unique. Here is my unique superpowers, or here's where I spike.
Yeah, I think the key is confidence, right? So you can come across as kind of uncomfortable with what happened, uh, embarrassed by it, worried about it, or like you said, it's a fake it till you make it. If you still come across as confident, like, yeah, it happened, but I see this as a great opportunity now. I can move on to something better. I can now look to elevate my career. I can now leverage what I have learned to do something bigger and better. And like you said, you don't dwell on it, you quickly address it. And I think, getting those references lined up and just to drop it in a conversation, say, I got no concerns about my performance. I can give you references today that are going to tell you, I'm a top performer. So, uh, this is not an issue. And I'm curious, oftentimes people who have been out of the workforce, the executive level for a while, may either do some consulting or put something in LinkedIn or their resume that kind of helps bridge that gap so it doesn't look like they've been sitting and doing nothing but searching for a job for 3 or 4 months. For you, how effective is that if it's real? If it's, if somebody's, working on their own AI project or, doing some board advising, things of that nature, is that helpful, or at least it's at a minimum showing more than nothing? I'm curious what recruiters see when they see those types of things that fill gaps after leaving a company.
Yeah. So one, it is okay to take a sabbatical. If somebody, needs to recharge, I commend that, right? Just as long as it's not, they're, it's showing a pattern, right? Or, um, if that pattern is showing, a lot of different jumps where they haven't really made an impact, then that's hard to justify for a company. But I think, if somebody had a really meaningful stint and then, took some time to recharge, or they went in and they did do some consulting and the consulting was impactful, or, they decided to do some vibe coding and they built a really wicked app that's getting some adoption, and they can actually prove that and show, hey, I built this thing, or this is what, I went out and I learned, or I took a course, or, I wanted to better my skills. I think that's all fabulous. They just need to be able to speak to it and speak to it intelligently. And so again, there's a number of candidates that I've met that have taken some time and have actually done consulting work and some really meaningful consulting, and they don't feature it on their LinkedIn. And it's really impressive. Like, I did this specific, project for this client that moved the needle over 6 months or over a year. Where I worked, in a couple of different, fractional engagements. And again, here's where I was making a significant impact in the short time that I was there. But again, they should have their SOAR stories ready. If it's not impactful, then don't share it. And so it's like, I've taken some time, right, to recharge. And in that time, I got time to spend with my kids or take care of a family member or whatever it may be, or, rest up, get in better shape. But it's got to be something. There's got
Right.
to be something of substance there.
Okay. So those are things to do. What about common red flags you see? So if you've got executives that, generally would look good on paper, you've met them, you think they're, a good candidate, what are some of the things that you see that you just kind of hit your head and go, why did you do that? Why did you put that on LinkedIn? Why did you write that article? Why did you make that comment? Is it getting too deep into politics? Is it, being nasty on social media? Is it including certain things in your background that were better just left off? I'm curious if you see kind of a more common denominator of what people tend to do and may not even realize, hey, that's going to create problems for you, and you may not be told to your face, but it's problematic.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. And so one, somebody's venting, whether again it's on social media or LinkedIn, I would really encourage folks to not do that. And so to keep it professional, don't speak ill of past employer, and just keep everything above board and really about where you're moving the ball forward, where you're learning, again, where um, you learn from past failures. So it's the EQ part, it's the self-awareness that really sticks out. And so if somebody, I can see on interviews if somebody is just not self-aware, where it's a lot of I, me, and um, there's just not a lot of, past learnings, or there's, um, a pattern of mistakes that are made. Whether again it was, they were laid off or not, or they left, but it was patterns of, oh well, I didn't like this, or I didn't like this, or I didn't like this, and it was just, it was just really consistent. So I look for consistent patterns. I look for consistent stories too. So, Mark Andreessen once said, the three things that he looks for: drive, curiosity, and ethics. And I absolutely 100% agree with that. If there's something where, again, a story doesn't match and it brings into question integrity or ethics, that's a non-starter for me. If somebody's not curious, right? If they're not, we're speaking and they're not leaning forward, they're not leaning in, as Sheryl Sandberg says, that also raises a big flag where, then they're probably not going to be very curious, if we put them into employment. And so we're looking for that grit, that, one, the integrity, the foundation of integrity needs to be there. That's a non-starter. But then on top of it, showing that, drive and curiosity and grit and tenacity and, again, really seeing that somebody has prepared themselves for this interview. Because I've run into a lot of those where, somebody gets on the phone and yeah, maybe they have been in a really compelling gig and they just weren't prepared to speak with me. Well, they're probably not going to be prepared to speak with my client then either. And so, that definitely brings up a red flag in terms of lack of preparation. So a few other checklists to consider when making a strong first impression. So dressing for success, short, succinct SOAR statements. So keeping it short and sweet, showing confidence, having really solid eye contact, a solid handshake, thinking about body language, shoulders back, no crossed arms, no, hand in front of the mouth, speaking slowly and making that positive connection with intent. So really to, show curiosity, and make sure that it's more of a dialogue versus I'm talking 80% of the time and the interviewer is just listening. It's really about, feeding back to them. Oh, well, that's interesting that you asked me this. This is what I've learned so far. Tell me more about this. And so again, you're showing a real interest in their business and them personally, the challenges that they're facing and how you can make an impact.
So with body language, you mentioned, leaning forward and things of that nature. I actually had a candidate years ago for a director level position, went in with a publicly traded, well-known biotech company. And when I spoke to the executive that was hiring manager, she said, yeah, the candidate slouched down like this the whole interview. And she said, I thought he was going to fall asleep. And said, it was a pretty intense 6-hour interview process, but she said, the impression of the team was, is he going to survive in this environment? Because it's just, if he can't make it through the interview without slouching down. So you bring up a great point about, something as basic as your body language, standing up straight, looking your best, making sure you project your voice, that you show physically interest in what's happening and not assume just that, by the way you respond that they can tell, oh, he or she is interested in what's being said here. So this is all really great information. Now, from a research standpoint, we've got AI now. So, you mentioned people not being prepared for an interview when they talk to you, even initially. With AI today, there's really no excuse for that. You can pretty much type in a couple of very short prompts and say, do the research for me. What level of research do you typically either recommend or expect from people at an executive level? Uh, it may be different than a hands-on operations type of a position that someone's recruiting for. What do you and what do other executives who are doing the interviewing typically expect to see from a research and a knowledge standpoint from somebody that's sitting in front of them?
So somebody is done their homework up front on the company, the position, uh, as much homework as they can on the executive themselves. But they've really taken, the time and effort. Now, at the same time, there's a, flip side to this too, where, some companies have been known to, do long interview processes, put people through, 6 rounds and then ghost them, which is just not cool. But at the same time, the candidates have to show up every time. And so, from a candidate lens, in terms of how I would coach a candidate, is just, I know if that's happened to you, it's terrible. And it's awful and it sucks. And I acknowledge that, but you have to keep going. And so you have to put your best foot forward. And to do that, you have to, really do as much upfront research as you can get on that company, looking at their competitors, looking at Glassdoor reviews, looking, maybe even talking to a customer up front. But something that's going to set you apart, right? It's going to make you different than everybody else. So you have to find a way again to set yourself apart. And so, that helps in terms of, again, doing as much research to show that you're, knowledgeable and fluent in that business. I will say, what I would also warn candidates to do not do is to use, AI during the interview. So one thing that's been brought up, we have a talent partner and human capital / CHRO roundtables, and there's been a big concern around deepfake interviews
Ooh.
happening with AI, and so I could tell you that I just know this is my gut. I'm not a complete predictor of this, but just given the amount of concern that's come up in the HR and talent community, I think there's definitely going to be there's going to be some rectification there over in a short period of time in terms of where there will be the opposite end, right, of being able to be able to better tell deepfake interviews. And so, yeah, I would advise a candidate not to do that, and also not to do AI during the interview, to be fully present.
So it's an interesting thing you bring up, and AI is, big thing that VentureLoop is into. It's a big thing, obviously, that most people, especially in the markets that we travel in, are into. So I'm curious, what is the concern now about candidates being able to essentially use AI to kind of navigate around some of the more standard screening processes you have to, I don't know if I want to say trick recruiters or companies into seeing something that's not there, but to really kind of enhance who that person is so that they've got a better chance to get a job, and you find out later maybe this wasn't the person we thought we were seeing.
Yeah. So again, it's a major concern, and I have not personally seen it a lot, but again, I've heard stories, certainly from my brethren in talent partner roles, and or in sitting in companies in HR roles, and or talent roles. And so again, it has been coming up and been coming up more frequently. And so I think, one, to watch the body language to see if somebody is typing or navigating, right? If you're on a video screen, that's definitely a bit harder to detect, especially if somebody has their pre-canned AI answers that are ready
Right.
for them, where then they can just kind of move their mouse so subtly, and then especially for a technical interview. But you can also tell if somebody is like reading off a script. And so there are ways to just stop the conversation midstream, and then pivot quickly to something else to see if that throws them off, or ask a different variant of that question. So again, there's ways to catch a canned answer. So I've definitely seen canned answers in over my years. And so again, I think that's where you just, as an interviewer, you have to insert yourself and catch it in midstream and then pivot quickly to see if that's a pattern.
Well, we've all interviewed sociopaths who are very good at, at navigating around those as well. Um, I would, I'm curious, in this day of age, an age of remote working and with Zoom calls and everything else, you know, how often, or I guess how soon do a lot of these companies from an executive level bring somebody in for a face to face? Because obviously it's a lot easier to navigate around using an AI in the background to answer these questions perfectly than if you're sitting in front of somebody face to face.
So I would say as soon as possible. So it's one thing to go through some initial vetting. The company goes through some initial vetting by a video, and I think that's fair to ensure that the candidate meets and exceeds the criteria and looks like to be a really good fit. And then it should then go to the stakeholders very quickly. So one big mistake that I see companies make is, a hiring manager won't be involved until the very, very end of the process to put their stamp of approval. Um, and that in almost every case has not worked out well. Maybe ultimately they do get the final hire, but from a process standpoint, it is not. I do not believe a great reflection on the company if the hiring manager is not showing their commitment to the hiring process. So it's again one thing to do some initial vetting around, let's say, technical competency and potentially using AI to do a technical competency vet, I think is fair, an initial one. But I think after that, there's going to be a lot of AI fatigue if there's more and more AI interviews that really, again, get into some of the hardcore subjective matters around, again, EQ, fit, and other things. So I've written articles on it as well in terms of where, I've seen that as a massive turnoff to candidates, and just, some candidates just flat out saying, look, we're not going to do an AI interview. This is insulting. And I
Yeah.
get that. So, again, both sides have to play their part. I think a candidate, has to, again, be prepared, show up, do their research, not waste the client's time, be presentable. I think, on the other side, our clients, have to, show inquisitiveness, have to be present, hiring manager involved early on. Um, and so, again, this is a match, right? Where both parties come to the table, put their best foot forward, and then hopefully, we're making a very, very quick match that makes an incredible long-term fit.
So you bring up a good point of match. I know this is an overused cliche comparison, but it really is kind of a dating for marriage type of a process where you are trying to fit two parties together, and we've seen it so many times where somebody who is a top performer in one company fails miserably at their next company. I've seen people go from large company like Google, they go to a smaller, fast-moving startup, and they just can't adjust because they have lived life with such a huge infrastructure, and now they are expected to do everything, and they can't do everything. So, as you and the company kind of start dancing to evaluate, is there a match here? You mentioned it's more than just what's on this resume. Does this match what the job requirement is? There's cultural fit, there's personality fit, there's how you work. You know, are you somebody who is more comfortable in a large company than a small scrappy company, etc.? What would you recommend to people to kind of ensure that who they are is fully communicated so that if they are fit, we know that it's not that they left something on the table and then they find out, oh, they wanted somebody who you know enjoyed doing this more, and the candidate says, well, I love that, why didn't we ever talk about that?
Yeah, and so it's the commitment to the definition up front. Now, granted, things move, right? And they do change. And you have to be incredibly versatile, as we know, in a startup, and deal with a heavy amount of ambiguity. At the same time, you need to be consistent in terms of defining the objective in terms of what that person's going to do, the hat that they're going to wear. and the problems that they're going to solve. And so, if someone comes in and then that um, goalpost has been moved significantly, that definitely creates more room for chaos and ambiguity, et cetera. And so, as much as the goal, the OKRs, the objectives can be defined upfront, and everybody is moving in the same direction, that's great. Now, at the same time, a skill could be discovered, right? That somebody brings to the table that expands the role and that makes them even more effective. And that happens, right? That absolutely happens. But I've also seen, I've seen people move from larger company into smaller company, but they're bringing something that's transferable. And so usually it's, yes, they worked in a big company, but they started up a whole new division from scratch
Hmm.
with fewer resources than you would get in terms of, big, large company, division product that you're just, maintaining and scaling from there. And so, I think those that have had to build something from scratch in larger companies, because sometimes larger companies actually, there's a myth that, maybe they don't bring as much discipline or process, or, they've gotten stale and tired. That's not always the case. And so I've definitely seen folks make transitions from larger companies into smaller companies, but they bring a playbook, typically a playbook for a smaller company or for that specific problem that they're trying to solve.
Well, absolutely. And I think you bring up a good point too. And I didn't mean to infer that people from large companies can't be successful at a smaller, scrappy startup. I mean, obviously there are many, as they call themselves, Zooglers, ex-Google people who have gone on to start very successful companies from the ground up. And so I guess that's actually an interesting point to talk about. If you are somebody who works at a larger organization, but you have the skill set and the desire to work at a scrappy startup, there can be a bias sometimes at these smaller companies saying, well, is this person who's been, a director or VP level at a company the size of Google or Meta, are they going to be comfortable slotting into something where, they don't have an executive admin that's going to do all of their, administrative stuff for them? How do people best position themselves in those situations so that when they go in for that interview, they can knock that concern out right out of the gate?
Yeah, well, I think they need to also be honest with themselves, and so that's part of the internal integrity, so to speak. So, if you're trying to again fit something right, it's a round peg into a square hole or whatever, that could be tricky if there's something. Um, let's say you're going in to build something from scratch and it's no team, but you're accustomed to working with some resources, and you know you just in your heart of heart that this is going to be a stretch for you. It might not be the right gig. Well, it's likely, very likely, that this is not the right gig, right? And a company's going to feel that too. And so it's one thing to challenge yourself and push yourself, but it's another thing to be dishonest with what you need to be successful in your capabilities and where you fit. And so I think it starts with a conversation with yourself in terms of what is a good match for me. I see a lot of executives trying to stretch out and make a complete career transition. But again, I think it's got to be where there are some parallels to the past. Some people have done it very successfully. They go on and it's like they have nothing to do with their past existence, but there's got to be something that ties things together. There's a skill set or some, again, unique value proposition that they're bringing to the table to their next gig. And so, again, as long as, there is some transferableness to the company, which you're trying to solve the problem for, and to yourself, then yeah, I think again, being honest and upfront with yourself about what your capabilities are is going to save a lot of time and effort and money and etc.
One of the final questions here, resume, no resume. A lot of executive level people kind of feel like, it's 2026. A resume is really a thing anymore. I'm known, I've got a background, I've got a LinkedIn profile. I can give you kind of a quick summary of bullet points of my successes. What is the current thinking on a traditional resume for executive level candidates?
I think resumes are helpful for our clients. Shows intent. It's part of the preparation, showing that a candidate is really interested and they've taken the time to prepare a resume and update it. At the same time, it's also easier to read than a LinkedIn profile. My advice on resumes would be to, try and keep it under 2 pages. That's a bit of the new norm these days. So again, a 4 or 5 page resume was passe. Maybe, 10, 15 years ago, that was a thing, but now it's again shorter, more concise, but with um, accomplishment statements versus just looking like it reads like a job description. So it's about impact. It's about um, putting measurable results, to uh, to the experience that they brought to the table. So I did this and I impacted this by X. I hired this many people, or we had to go through unfortunate reposition of the company, but now we're doing much more with less. Or I had to a reduction in force in my group, but we're doing more with less, and here's how. So with AI, but also beyond AI, here's how we're really impacting the company. And so again, the more measurable and impactful it can be, the better. So again, it's all about how did you make a company money? How did you save them money? How did you make the company more productive? How did you make your group more productive? How did you make the customer happy?
Gotcha. And as people kind of prepare for potential search, and I mean, honestly, I believe everybody, even if you're extremely happy with the company you're at, you should always have some level of a plan, put out some feelers, keep networking, because you just never know. Your company could be acquired out of the blue, and you know you're done, and you don't want to be caught flat-footed. So
Or get a 6 a.m. email,
yes,
right?
exactly. Where some of these companies have very interesting processes to do this.
Yeah.
Uh, what's your advice to people on how to just keep general preparations on day to day, just in case they may need to do a job search in the future? Is it keeping an updated LinkedIn profile? Is it posting something on LinkedIn every now and again? You know, Reaching out to people like yourself to make sure you've got a few recruiter relationships in your back pocket and that you keep them warm in the event that you may need them someday. What are some of the things you typically recommend, just so people kind of keep fresh for the market if they ever need to use it?
Yeah. So keeping current, one on current affairs within their industry. So going to trade shows, networking, being out there in the market first and foremost. Conversations happening, just being active, and just consistent networking over anything. Posting, again, you got to be careful in terms of, how provocative some posts are. And so, sometimes that can show a lot of great knowledge, but sometimes it can be a little bit overly provocative. Um, and so, again, I think you just got to be really, really careful about what content you're putting out there. I would say, generally speaking, stay away from politics, right? Stay away from personal stuff as much as possible. But really, it's about just constant networking in the field, definitely with folks like us. But more so, I think, with peers and fellow brethren, and then just keeping the knowledge base fresh. Use AI, right? Get in there. I mean, obviously, AI is going to change the world for better or for worse, and so embrace it, vibe code, get in there, learn it, love it. Be familiar with it because companies are really valuing AI these days in terms of what it can do, and so yeah.
So one last question as it relates to AI now. It's great advice on making sure you're knowledgeable about it. One thing that I found interesting is that in our bubble, AI is a lot more prominent than when you go outside of the San Francisco, California tech sphere. When I visit other places around the country, It's definitely not as well known or as integrated into everything. So when somebody is doing AI, whether they're in that world now or there are some people in other parts of the country who may want to work for a company based in technology space in the Bay Area, say, what is truly effective, valuable from an AI standpoint? How deep does it really need to be for it to actually matter? And what I mean by that is I'm curious from the executives that are doing the hiring and making these decisions, how knowledgeable are they actually of some of the more complex AI projects that you can do with the technology that's out there now? When you say vibe code, that can mean everything from, me who has, no coding experience, and I can use codecs to vibe codes and very basic things to put on my own desktop and, make a simple mobile app, things like that. Are those kinds of things, even that basic, really impressive because it's unique for people at an executive level who are not obviously, interviewing for CTO, but somebody who's a CFO, VP of marketing, that kind of thing? Or do you recommend people really do start taking some classes at certain times and get pretty sophisticated with how this stuff actually works?
I would encourage folks to again lean on the network for those that are most proficient in AI. Um, and so, for example, I'll give you an example of something that I did. I was working on an assessment app, like a scorecard assessment app, a couple of years ago, and it would have cost me a fortune to go build this thing. In today's day and age, I worked with a CTO friend to, build it in essentially like 30 minutes, um, and with a couple of, key prompts and, it needs a little bit of refinement, but, I saw it in action, right? Like how this gets built. And um, I've done this with a few other projects as well. And so, I think again, leaning on folks that are a little bit further advanced right now, working with, whether it's Cursor, Replit, Claude, whatever it might be. Um, so yeah, I would say, again, this is a place to really lean on the network and just go build something, and so once you've gotten some of that knowledge from some of your friends, try it out, like test it out on things, a passion project. Even if, somebody was interested in writing a book, to see how, AI would be in terms of, putting forth something that again is a passion project that's on their mind in terms of, writing something. And so there's just a lot of applications that, you can use to apply AI. And so, I would just say, just, try and get hands-on, learn the prompts, where they're most effective. Even if it's at a relatively basic level, like just, test out different things. If I do this prompt versus this prompt, does it get me a different result? And then compare it to others like Gemini or OpenAI or, Claude or, Microsoft. And so, yeah, I think just, becoming just more fluent, generally speaking, I think is definitely going to be more impressive for an employer in today's day and age.
Well, I know you do a lot of technical recruiting, but I'm just curious for a non-technical executive, how much can you stand out if you do something like that? So, say a chief marketing officer who, as you said, connected with a friend who's got technology experience, and they built a basic application using vibe coding that can assist in making their marketing more efficient. Is that pretty unique, or is that becoming more commonplace? Like this is something you're going to have that just to compete with everybody else.
Yeah, I think it's the latter for sure, to compete against everybody else. I mean, I've met operating partners because we have an operating partner roundtable, where they've embraced it with their portfolio companies, and they're doing some, amazing things already in terms of, pipeline management, lead gen analysis, building a true CRM outside of Salesforce. I mean, doing lots and lots of stuff. Again, the tracking in terms of, the administrative part in terms of, tracking commissions and, assessing their sales force and, how SDRs are doing. I mean, there's just a lot that's happening. Same with, building, marketing pipelines and, growth hacking. I mean, there's just a lot that's being done in other functions. I mean, within HR, we're HR and recruiting, we're seeing a lot as well, where a lot of these tools are becoming very, very advanced in terms of, our own pipeline tracking and ATS and, sourcing has really been made a lot easier with some of the new tools. So research and sourcing, especially in our world. And so, yeah, it's definitely happening outside of tech. And so, yeah, I absolutely believe that, the masses, again, whether they're based in Silicon Valley or outside, they need to, embrace this as much as possible. And I know that there's a lot of skepticism and a lot of backlash against AI, but at the same time, it is a differentiator to set someone apart.
Great.
By utilizing it.
Well, Dan, I've appreciated you being with us today. It's been awesome catching up with you as well. And for yourself, if people either want to connect with you, with your firm, where would they go? Do you have any writings or books or other things? Here's a chance just to let people know where to go if they want to learn more about you or connect with you.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Jeremy, and thank you for spending the time together here and for catching up. And so a couple of ways to reach me. So one, I have a newsletter called the Executive Whisper up on LinkedIn. It would be great if you want to subscribe to it. There's a lot of content around everything that we were talking about today. So hiring, around attrition, around how to position yourself best, what makes a great CEO. I also put an article out there about the operating partner roundtable and the findings that we had there, as well as the findings that we had in the talent partner corporate executive search roundtable. You can get me by email, dan@flemingmartin.com, or you can reach me by phone, 415-722-2964. Just text me and let's set up a call.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and appreciate the time we've had. And we got to keep in touch more often now. It's been a little while.
I would love that.
All right, Dan. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
We hope you have enjoyed today's show. If you are interested in being on a future podcast, please send an email to podcast@ventureloop.com.